In the summer of 1970, Janis Joplin went home. Not San Francisco. That was her chosen home, the city that had taken her in and given her a stage and a sound and a reason to stay. She went to the other home, the first one, the one she had spent every year since 1963 trying to put behind her. Port Arthur, Texas. She went for her 10-year high school reunion. She had the #1 album. She had the magazine covers. She had the sold-out arenas and the Porsche painted with the history of the universe and the fur coat from Southern Comfort. She had everything Port Arthur had told her she would never have. And she drove back into the flat Gulf Coast streets of the town that had voted her ugliest man on campus, and she shook hands with the people who had been in the room when it happened. She was 27 years old. She had 3 months left to live. She didn't know that. She was just going home. She had told the world what Port Arthur had done to her. Not quietly, on national television. The Dick Cavett Show, the most watched late-night interview program in America. She had said, in those exact words, "They laughed me out of class, out of town, and out of the state." Port Arthur had watched that broadcast. The people who had been in those classrooms had watched it. The teachers who had looked away. The boys who had voted. The girls who had kept their distance. They had watched her say it. They knew she was coming back for the reunion. They knew she knew what they had done. She arrived with an entourage. Of course she did. You don't go back to the place that destroyed you without armor. The armor was the feather boa, the beads, the sunglasses, the people around her who knew who she was and would remind the town if it forgot. She held a press conference in Port Arthur, Texas, for her 10-year high school reunion. Cameras and reporters in a town that had once been the place in the world most certain she would amount to nothing. She was cordial. She was gracious. She answered questions. She did not name names. She did not use the platform. And she had a platform. She was the biggest rock star in America. To humiliate specific people in the room. She could have. She had every right to. The math was not complicated. Here were the people who had made her childhood a specific and documented misery, and here she was, a famous and powerful person with a room full of cameras, and she could have said anything she wanted about any of them. She chose not to. Then a reporter asked the question, "Were you invited to the prom?" The bravado dropped for a moment, just a moment. The chin that had been up came down. The eyes that had been direct moved toward the floor. "No," she said. "I was not invited to the prom." The cameras caught it. That specific micro-expression, the armor slipping, the original wound visible underneath the performance for just 1 second. She was 27 years old, the most famous female rock singer in America, and a question about a high school dance she hadn't been invited to could still find the girl from Port Arthur underneath everything else she had built. She pulled the armor back up. The interview continued. She was cordial. After the press conference, she moved through the reunion. She sought out specific people, not the ones who had voted for her to win Ugliest Man on campus, not the ringleaders of the organized cruelty that had made Thomas Jefferson High School a specific kind of hell. She found the ones who had been on the edges, the ones who had been quiet, the ones who had not participated but had also not stopped it, the witnesses. She shook their hands. She asked about their lives. She was warm with them, genuinely warm, not performed warmth. The warmth of someone who understood the difference between the people who had done something and the people who had simply watched, and who had decided somewhere between Port Arthur and San Francisco and Monterey and New York and Tampa and Tanglewood that she was not going to spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of the watchers along with the weight of the actors. She let them off the hook, quietly, without announcement. That is a specific kind of generosity, the kind that costs something real. The reunion was not warm. The overall event was not what she had been hoping for, whatever she had been hoping for. The acceptance she had been looking for since she was 16 years old was not in that room, not on that night. The people there were polite and complicated and did not know how to be in the presence of someone they had wronged and who had then become famous. She had gone looking for something she couldn't quite name. She left without it. She never came back to Port Arthur again. She died 3 months later. Here is what needs to be understood about that reunion. Janis Joplin had spent 2 years telling the world what Port Arthur had done to her. She had said it on television, in magazines, in interviews. She had made the cruelty of her childhood part of her public story, not as self-pity, but as explanation. This is where I came from. This is what it cost. This is why the voice sounds the way it sounds. She had every right, walking into that reunion room, to use the platform she had built to settle accounts. She didn't. Not because she had forgiven them. She hadn't, not entirely. The prom question proved that. The wound was still there, exactly where it had always been, waiting for the right question to expose it. But she had decided that using her power to wound people who had once used their power to wound her was not the kind of person she wanted to be, not the kind of use she wanted to make of the platform she had built with so much pain. She could have. She chose not to. That is a harder thing than shouting into a microphone. It is harder than waiting backstage with your arms crossed until the police move. It is harder than playing a free concert in the rain. It is harder to be kind to people who hurt you than to punish them, always. She did it anyway. The town of Port Arthur eventually built a museum for her. They sell her face on T-shirts. They run driving tours to the places she lived. They are proud of her now. The people who were at that reunion are in their 80s now. Some of them have talked about it. None of them have said she was unkind to them. None of them have said she was warm in the way that costs nothing, the performed warmth of someone who wants to seem gracious. They have said she was just there, present, real, cordial in the way of someone who has made a private decision about how to be in a room and is following through on it. She made a private decision about how to be in that room. She followed through. 3 months later, she was gone. The town she came back to, with grace she had not been given, sells her face on T-shirts now. Here is what this story asks you. Have you ever had the power to hurt someone who once hurt you and chosen not to use it? Not because you had forgiven them, not because the wound had healed, but because the person you want to be doesn't use power that way. Janis Joplin walked into the room where she had been voted Ugliest Man on campus, and she shook hands with the watchers, and she was warm, and she didn't name names. And when a reporter asked about the prom, she told the truth. No, I was not invited. And then she pulled the armor back up and kept going. She was 27 years old. She had 3 months left. She didn't know that. She just knew that the kind of person she wanted to be didn't use a national platform to wound people who had once used a gymnasium to wound her. She went home. She was kinder than any of them deserved. She never came back. Subscribe. The next story goes somewhere nobody has taken you before.